would like to tell you a little bit about this fellow that stands right behind me here, or sits right behind me. I've known him for a lot of years, believe me. My father and his mother were brother and sister, and they used to come and visit our community from time to time. And I remember one very vivid occasion when he and his brother Eldon came to visit our little community, and we all, the kids in the neighborhood, about 4 or 5 or 6 of us, rode our bicycles way up this, we call it the Gulch. It was virtually a desert of mountains, I guess you'd say, but there was one big tall tree up there. And up in that tall tree was an eagle's nest. And we wanted to see what was inside that nest. Very curious. So some of the older guys climbed up there, and sure enough, there's a couple of eaglets in there. And by 11-year-old Edwin climbed up there too. But I tell you, if you've ever seen a lumberjack come slide down a pole, he came down even faster and was trimming that tree as he went. And the eagle was diving at him. And so we're glad that the eagle didn't get to him before he got to us. So I'd like to explain a little bit about him further. Dr. Noyes practiced in Forest Grove, Oregon for 40 years, retiring in 2000. Served in the U.S. Army as a physician in Vietnam in 1967 and 68. In 1971, he was, and boy, there's some stories there we could tell you about how the Lord protected him in that situation as well. He was a surgeon for the mission hospital in Phuket, Thailand. He received a master's degree in public health in 1979. His special interest in medicine has been nutrition and preventative medicine, and for 45 years conducting seminars. These seminars have been conducted in the USA and several other countries since 1971. Dr. Noyes researched the original and foundational principles of the New Age alternative medical therapies in order to gain an understanding in depth. This information is presented in this book, and he's going to be giving away some of these books tomorrow. For 20 years, the information that he has been sharing in lectures, in seminars, and in books, and at camp meetings, and churches, and also in many countries. He'll open up some of that tonight and tomorrow. So I hope and pray that each one of you will attend all of his meetings. Dr. Noyes, it's all yours.
Thank you. Okay. Coming here was kind of like going. Coming here was somewhat like getting back to college, running into so many friends that I had at Walla Walla some time past. It was amazing. I wondered what happened to them through the years and didn't realize they all migrated down to this town. But I am grateful to be with you tonight. What I present tonight is the history of our health message. And I present it for a particular reason. What I do plan to present tomorrow will be the opposite of what we have tonight. When taking medicine, the first 2 years you spend all of your time learning the normal of the body. We as students were anxious to be out there stomping disease and getting rid of disease, but the professors know you need to know the normal before you know the abnormal. In fact, if you know the normal well enough, you will recognize the abnormal without much effort. And that's why tonight I want to present the history of our health message and the great benefit that God has blessed us with that message. Because we're going to contrast it on tomorrow with the devil's counterfeit that has entered our church in a big way. And so learning the normal, and if we review the normal of what we've had in God's guidance, then we will find it much easier to recognize the counterfeit. So let us proceed on our journey tonight. We like to think of the health message that God gave being an integral part of our lives and our church, and that it has been. So tonight, as told by D.E. Robinson, a secretary of Ellen White her last 15 years. When I was a freshman, I had the privilege of taking a class by Mr. Robinson. He taught the story of our health message, and so much of what I'm bringing tonight is what I learned in that class nearly 60 years ago. Let's go back to the ancient time of the Sumerian civilization over in the Babylon area in present-day Iraq. We have records, clay tablets, and so forth that tell us what the medical practices were like. They had some reason, sense and reason to what they did in that time, 3,000 years past. But then, keeping up to the time of the Egyptian exodus, the children of Israel exiting from Egypt, medical approach at this time had become all mystical. There was nothing that made physiologic sense. We have good records in the papyrus writings of how they did, what they did, and their belief of the cause of disease. It was all mystical, and it made no sense. But when the children of Israel were taken out of Egypt and taken across the desert, God gave to them health rules. The health rules that he gave them are the health rules of public health today. They were true, based upon truth, and they functioned. Separation of disease, many other things in the Old Testament there, but they're the foundation of the public health rules of today. God blessed his people. Whenever he brought to his people spiritual enlightenment, he also has given physical enlightenment of well-being and lifestyle. So we followed the children across the desert, and you remember where they came to a particular place where water was, some pools, but they themselves had been very much free of water for some 3 days or so and were thirsty. And they came upon these pools and were so disappointed when they found them to be bitter. Moses cut a brush. God told him to throw it into the water became sweet, and they drank of that. You're all acquainted with the story. And this particular saying that we see on the slide was said following that, and God said, "If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God, do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments, keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases on you, which I have brought on the Egyptians. For I am the Lord who heals you." Let's go to Deuteronomy 8:4. He says, "Here your garments did not wear out on you, nor did your feet swell these 40 years. The blessings of God as they followed his directions." Psalms 105, "And there was no feeble among their tribes." What a blessing. The early church had a lot of success, and there was a growth in the health understanding. We have writings that show some of the early church fathers were physicians, and their writings showed cause and reason to effect. They understood the cause of disease to some degree. But in time, they lost that knowledge, and this primarily came about because the adulteration of the doctrines where the soul was divided from the body. Therefore, the body didn't count for anything and was not considered of value, only the soul. And so the medical treatment and the knowledge begin to go down, and whenever darkness spiritually comes, or we accept it, the knowledge of health and healing drops as well. During the Dark Ages, medicine in the part of Europe that was under control of the dominant church was suppressed. In fact, it even became against their laws to have any type of medical therapy. We'll see if we could, there we go. Let's back up one there. There we are. It even became there in the 12th century a death sentence to be practicing medicine, to be practicing surgery. So the doctors and surgeons tended to leave Western Europe, and they went actually to Iraq, or that day Baghdad area, and then on to India. And so the knowledge of medicine was preserved by the physicians fleeing Western Europe and preserving this knowledge that they had at that point over in those eastern countries. And then as the Renaissance began to come forth, there was a return of knowledge, and they began to make studies, and the beginning of scientific approach, studying carefully by observing and repeating. This knowledge began to bring forth benefits of increased knowledge. And there still, though, was not a good knowledge of what caused disease. We come to the middle of the 19th century, the middle of the 1800s. There was no knowledge of chemistry as we know it today. Physics, physiology was a non-science at this point. And disease in this country was quite similar to what had been down through the ages in medieval Europe. There was no understanding of disease related to filth and the salvation of health through cleanliness. And if you were to go to the city of Boston in the year 1800, 3/4 of the deaths were from tuberculosis. The great plague of the Middle Ages had been infectious diseases. And then the disease of the burgeoning industrial society was tuberculosis. The steam engines started in around 1750, and then the cities were formed where they had their manufacturing plants, and they lived together, worked long hours, and tuberculosis became the scourge of the world, in this country as well. But at this time, very slowly, the increase of knowledge of the true functioning of the body and the cause of disease began to slowly unravel. And it wasn't actually till in the mid-1800s that it really took off. And thereafter, we saw a great increase. Let's look a little bit at some of the practices at that day if you were sick. If you had a fever or were ill of a certain type, you would be put in a dark room, no circulation of air, you would be restricted of water. Today we would do the opposite. There had been, back in the days, Hippocrates, he had seen disease as a cause from a lifestyle. And that was about 450 BC. About 200 BC, Galen, a great physician in the city of, in western Turkey of today, he changed that whole style, and he became the doctor of the age. And for 1700 years, his ideas of the cause of disease and how to deal with them became prominent across all of Europe, most of the world, and certainly America. And one of those approaches that he promoted was pushing all sites of chemicals and minerals and things, having no concept of what caused disease, having a totally wrong concept, and treating it with things he had no idea how they functioned. And the great chemical used throughout the ages was mercury. Now even the minute amounts, people are worried about it. Then they gave big doses repeatedly for every illness. These were the drugs that Ellen White was talking about. Bacteria was not recognized till around 1860, thereabouts, in the middle of the century. And so now they begin to have an idea of what caused infections, these different types of bacteria. Still no comprehension of the value of cleanliness. And as you see illustrated here, this was a rather typical thing in the United States, especially in the southeast part. And the control of body waste, of nutrition was poor. The condition of health and the knowledge of healthful living was really dismal. Nutrition, that looks appetizing. But remember, those days in the winter, you had pickled vegetables and salted meats and so forth. You didn't have the transportation. You didn't, nothing like we have, a whole different type of living. And so it laid the foundation for disease. We're just showing some pictures here of the different, the preservation of foods even had some problems, the salting of them and the usage. And the barbecuing and heating high the meats was also causes of problems. The frequent use of tobacco and alcohol. Tobacco was prescribed for respiratory infection on that. This has its stubbornness. There we go. Coffee and tea were used constantly. The first picture there, will not go back, is illustrating the work hours were 12 hours a day, 7 days a week in many of these workshops in New York and elsewhere. The conditions were such to propagate tremendous problems among the population. And one of the big problems was the beginning to cheaply produce the refined flour. For years it had to be crushed and then sieved, put through a sieve of silk cloths to get the fine white flour. Of course, the nutrients had been removed. And then when it became possible through steel rollers that rolled together and crushed the grain, it was very cheap to produce the refined grains, and therefore only the rich had previously been able to afford it. Now the poor people could, and the refined flours became popular and became a status symbol to be able to have that, and that became a nutritional problem. During this period of great stress of medicine and of health, there were some attempts to improve, but the main medical practice was not good. Medical treatment usually was worthless. As you see, they're mostly harmful and often deadly. All right. With the treatment so bad, this opened the door for alternative types of approach, always looking for a better way. And some of those alternative approaches worked because what they did is they did not do what the general medical practice was doing. So whatever they did was given the credit. It may have had no influence of benefit, but what they didn't do was what really was the benefit. And so it would get the credit, and there was one particular one called homeopathy that for over 200 years was popular, considered good, but what it did was not do the bad things. But what they were doing as their basic treatment and giving credit to it was really not having any influence as we know today. But back in the 1777, there was a ship at sea that developed infection of typhus among the sailors. And so many sailors became ill that they would put them down in the bottom hole of the ship where it was hot, humid, dark, and no circulation of fresh air. And so many sailors became ill that they finally, the ones down below were so sick they begged for water and they wouldn't give them water. And finally they brought them up and put them on the deck and figured they're going to die, and they would bring the ones just coming down with disease, put them down in the bottom of the hole. And the ones on the deck begged for water, and so they began to give them water and splash water over them, and they got well. So the ship doctor attempted to share this information with other sea captains and ship doctors. It didn't go very far. It was standard therapy, and you weren't to change.